Years before any of that ever happened, Angela had already learned what it meant to live in a house where her place never felt secure. Growing up, she was never the daughter people paid attention to, not the one relatives asked about, not the one her parents spoke proudly of when guests visited. She was simply there, present but unnoticed, while everything in that home seemed to orbit around someone else. Her sister was always the center of every conversation, every celebration, every expectation, and Angela learned very early that no matter what she did, it would never be enough to change that balance. When she brought home good grades, they were acknowledged with a nod, but when her sister achieved anything, even something small, the entire family reacted like it was worth celebrating, like it meant something bigger, something more important. It wasn't just the praise, it was the way decisions were made, quiet but consistent. Her sister's preferences always came first, her comfort always mattered more, and Angela was expected to adjust without question, without complaint, as if that was simply her role. Over time, those moments stopped feeling like isolated incidents and started forming a pattern she couldn't ignore, a pattern that followed her through every stage of her life, shaping how she saw herself and how she expected others to treat her. There were dinners where she spoke and no one responded, holidays where gifts felt like obligations rather than thoughtfulness, and conversations where her opinions were dismissed before she could even finish explaining them. It didn't happen all at once, it happened slowly, in small ways that built up until the silence around her became louder than anything anyone could say. By the time she reached her early 20s, the distance between her and the rest of the family was no longer something subtle. It was clear, defined, and impossible to ignore. Arguments didn't explode. They ended quickly because no one really listened, and eventually Angela stopped trying to explain herself at all, because she understood that nothing she said would change how she was seen. The final break didn't come from one dramatic moment, it came from something quieter, a realization that staying meant accepting a version of herself that had already been decided by others, and she refused to keep living that way. So she left, without a long goodbye, without promises to stay in touch, taking only what she needed and walking away from a place that had never truly felt like hers. The years that followed were not easy, but they were hers, and for the first time, she learned how to exist without being compared, without being overlooked, building a life piece by piece with no one there to define her value. And in all that time, no one from that family came looking, no calls, no messages, no attempts to reconnect, just a silence that confirmed what she had already known before she left, that to them, her absence didn't change anything at all. Life outside that past gave Angela something she had never been allowed to build before, control over her own direction, her own choices, and eventually, her own sense of stability. She didn't find it all at once. It came through long workdays, small apartments, and decisions she had to make without anyone guiding her, but each step made her more certain of who she was without the weight of constant comparison. It was during that time that she met Derek Vaughn, and unlike everything she had experienced before, their connection didn't begin with pressure or expectations. It started quietly, with conversations that didn't feel like they were being judged or measured. Derek wasn't someone who tried to impress people. He didn't fill silence just to be heard, and he didn't make promises he couldn't keep, which made him stand out in a way that felt unfamiliar at first, but quickly became something Angela trusted. He paid attention, not in grand gestures, but in small consistent ways that made it clear he saw her as she was, not as someone to be compared or corrected. Over time, what they built together felt steady, something grounded in mutual understanding rather than performance, and for Angela, that stability mattered more than anything else because it was something she had never been given before. As her life settled into something more structured, she also built connections that were chosen rather than inherited, and one of those was Kevin Shaw, a colleague who became someone she relied on not for emotional reassurance, but for clear, practical perspective when situations became complicated. Kevin wasn't overly involved in her personal life, but he noticed patterns quickly and spoke directly when something didn't make sense, which made him someone Angela listened to when it mattered. When Derek proposed, it wasn't surrounded by spectacle. There was no audience, no pressure. Just a quiet moment where he made a promise in his own way, one that focused on honesty rather than perfection, and Angela accepted because it aligned with everything she had come to value. The engagement itself didn't draw attention immediately, but eventually, news of it reached people she hadn't heard from in years, and the response was sudden, almost calculated in how quickly it appeared. Her family reached out, not gradually, but all at once, messages that sounded warm, invitations that suggested they wanted to reconnect, and apologies that felt rehearsed rather than genuine. Angela didn't respond right away because she understood how silence could carry meaning, but the persistence continued until ignoring it felt like a decision rather than a reaction. When contact finally happened, the tone was different from what she remembered, softer on the surface, careful with words, as if they were trying to rebuild something that had never truly been stable to begin with. They spoke about the past without addressing specifics. They focused on moving forward without acknowledging what had been left unresolved, and they expressed interest in being part of her upcoming wedding, which created a situation Angela had not expected to face again. She didn't accept immediately, but she also didn't refuse, because part of her wanted to see whether time had changed anything or if it had only changed how things were presented. In the weeks that followed, communication increased, plans were discussed, and arrangements were made that included them in ways that felt formal rather than personal, and although nothing seemed openly wrong, there was something about the timing, the sudden involvement, and the controlled way everything was approached that Kevin noticed before Angela chose to question it herself. At first, the shift in behavior seemed controlled rather than genuine. Angela noticed it in the way her family interacted during planning conversations. Everything sounded polite, measured, almost rehearsed, as if each word had been chosen in advance to avoid conflict rather than rebuild anything real. They showed interest in details that didn't require emotional involvement, guest lists, seating arrangements, timelines, but avoided anything that would have forced them to address the past directly. It created a version of connection that looked functional on the surface while remaining distant underneath, and although Angela didn't challenge it openly, she paid attention to what wasn't being said just as much as what was. Olivia, however, approached things differently. She didn't stay within those controlled boundaries. Instead, she inserted herself into moments that didn't naturally involve her, offering to help Derek with small tasks, suggesting adjustments to plans that required them to spend time together, and positioning herself in conversations that gradually shifted focus away from Angela without appearing obvious at first. None of it was direct enough to confront immediately, but it happened often enough to form a pattern that couldn't be ignored once it became clear. Derek didn't encourage it. His responses stayed consistent, polite but distant, keeping interactions brief and avoiding situations where they were alone longer than necessary. But Olivia adapted quickly, finding ways to create proximity under the appearance of normal involvement. It showed up in unexpected places, messages sent late under the excuse of coordination, casual remarks that carried an undertone of familiarity that hadn't been earned, and moments where she spoke as if she understood Derek in ways that didn't match the reality of their limited connection. Angela didn't react right away, not because she didn't notice, but because reacting without certainty would have created a situation she couldn't control, and control was something she had learned to value too much to risk losing again. Instead, she observed, measuring consistency, looking for confirmation rather than assumption, and it was during that process that Kevin began to notice the same inconsistencies from a different angle. He wasn't emotionally connected to the situation, which allowed him to see patterns without being influenced by expectation, and when he pointed them out, he did it without exaggeration, focusing only on what could be verified rather than what could be interpreted. He mentioned timing first, how often Olivia's messages aligned with moments Derek was unavailable, then behavior, how her involvement increased when Angela wasn't present, and finally intent, not stated directly, but implied through repetition that didn't serve any practical purpose. Angela listened, not because she needed someone to confirm what she already sensed, but because hearing it framed without emotion made it clearer that this wasn't something that would resolve on its own. The situation hadn't escalated yet. There was no confrontation, no open conflict. But the structure beneath everything had started to shift, and for the first time since her family reappeared, Angela recognized that what looked like reconciliation might have been something else entirely, something built on intention rather than change. A few days before the wedding, the situation finally moved from observation to confirmation. Derek didn't approach the conversation with hesitation. He spoke directly, choosing clarity over delay, and what he explained aligned with the pattern that had been forming without needing to be exaggerated. He described how the interactions with Olivia had shifted over time, starting with casual involvement that seemed harmless, then becoming more deliberate, more frequent, and eventually crossing into something that no longer matched the boundaries he had kept in place. He didn't present it as confusion or misunderstanding. He made it clear that he had recognized the intent behind it and had already rejected it, firmly and without leaving room for interpretation. There were no mixed signals in his explanation, no attempts to soften the reality of what had happened, only a straightforward account of actions, responses, and the point where he understood that this wasn't something that would stop on its own. Angela listened without interrupting, not because she was surprised, but because she needed to hear how he framed it, whether it matched what she had already observed and what Kevin had pointed out from a distance. What mattered wasn't just what happened, but how it was handled, and Derek's response showed consistency, not only in what he said, but in how he had chosen to deal with it before bringing it to her. That consistency removed uncertainty, replacing it with something more defined, something that could be addressed without hesitation. Angela didn't react emotionally. There was no visible shift in her expression, no immediate judgment, because for her, this wasn't a new kind of situation. It was a familiar pattern appearing in a different form. The difference now was that she had control over how she responded, and she chose not to respond in a way that would reveal what she knew. Instead of confronting Olivia, instead of canceling the wedding, she made a decision that went against what most people would expect. She chose to continue as if nothing had changed. That choice wasn't made out of denial, it was made with intention. Because acting too soon would have ended the situation without exposing the full extent of what had been planned. Kevin was brought into that decision not as someone to influence it, but as someone who could help structure it, and his role became practical, focused on gathering what could be proven rather than what could be assumed. They didn't rely on speculation, they focused on verifiable interactions, documented communication, and timing that could not be explained away as coincidence. Angela didn't need to monitor every detail. She focused on key moments, ensuring that what they collected reflected behavior rather than interpretation. There were no confrontations during that time, no signs that anything had shifted, because maintaining that appearance allowed the situation to develop further, revealing more than it would have if it had been interrupted early. Every step was deliberate, controlled, and aligned with a single outcome, not to argue, not to defend, but to present something that could not be dismissed once it was seen. Back at the vineyard, everything shifted in a matter of seconds. The ceremony had been moving forward without interruption, guests seated in neat rows, attention focused on the couple at the center, until a voice cut through the space with enough force to stop every movement at once. Olivia didn't wait for permission. She stepped forward from where she had been standing, her expression controlled, her pace steady, and positioned herself where everyone could see her clearly before she spoke again. The accusation wasn't framed as a question or uncertainty. It was delivered as a statement, direct and specific, leaving no space for interpretation, and the reaction from the crowd came immediately, not as disbelief, but as shock that quickly turned into attention. She raised her phone, holding it at an angle that allowed the nearest guests to see first, then turning slightly so others could follow, and within moments, The visual proof she presented began to circulate through the audience, drawing people closer, creating a ripple of whispers that grew louder with each second. The images looked convincing at a glance, the messages structured in a way that suggested continuity, and for those who didn't know what to question, it appeared complete enough to accept without hesitation. Derek responded without delay, stepping forward with a firm denial that didn't match the tone of panic people expected in that moment. But his words struggled to compete with the visual narrative already forming in front of the guests. The atmosphere changed rapidly, shifting from celebration to confrontation, and as voices rose, the focus moved away from verification and toward judgment. Angela's family reacted first, not by asking for clarification, but by aligning themselves with what they believed they were seeing. Their response is immediate and decisive, reinforcing the direction the situation was already taking. Accusations replaced questions, assumptions replaced patience, and the structure of the ceremony collapsed as people stood, moved closer, and spoke over each other, creating a level of noise that made it difficult for any single voice to be heard clearly. Someone near the back mentioned contacting authorities, not as a confirmed action, but as a reaction to the perceived seriousness of what had just been revealed, and that suggestion alone added another layer of tension to the unfolding scene. Olivia maintained her position, not raising her voice unnecessarily, allowing the reaction of others to amplify her claim instead, and in that moment, she appeared composed, as if everything was proceeding according to a plan she had already anticipated. Derek attempted to speak again, but the environment no longer allowed for controlled explanation, and each attempt to respond was interrupted by overlapping voices that had already formed conclusions. Angela remained where she was, not stepping forward, not retreating, holding her position while the situation escalated around her, and although attention briefly shifted toward her, expecting an emotional reaction, she did not provide one, which only added to the confusion among those watching. The ceremony space no longer resembled what it had been minutes earlier, the order replaced by movement, the quiet replaced by layered conversation, and at the center of it, the accusation continued to expand, carried by repetition rather than verification, shaping the perception of everyone present before any structured response could take place. Angela didn't raise her voice, she simply reached for the remote. The movement was small, almost unnoticed at first, but it redirected attention in a way nothing else in that moment could, shifting focus away from the noise and toward something controlled, something intentional. When the screen behind them lit up, the reaction in the room changed again, not louder this time, but sharper. As people adjusted from reacting to watching, waiting to see what would follow. The footage began without explanation, a clear recording from a private setting, showing Olivia in a way no one present had seen before, not composed, not calculated in the same controlled way she had been moments earlier, but direct, focused, and unmistakably deliberate. She spoke first, not in fragments, but in complete statements that left no ambiguity about her intentions, expressing interest that went beyond anything appropriate, positioning herself as an alternative rather than a participant in a family event. Derek's response followed without delay, consistent with everything he had already explained, firm, clear, and without hesitation, rejecting what was being suggested and reinforcing where he stood without leaving space for reinterpretation. The shift in Olivia's demeanor came next, not gradual, but immediate, her tone tightening as the rejection settled, her words changing from persuasion to something more controlled, more calculated, and in that transition, the underlying intent became visible in a way that couldn't be dismissed as misunderstanding. She didn't attempt to hide it, she stated it plainly, outlining a plan that relied on altering perception rather than reality, referencing messages, images, and the idea that what people believed could be shaped if presented convincingly enough. The recording ended without transition, the screen going dark again, but the silence that followed carried more weight than the noise that had filled the space earlier, because this time, the room wasn't reacting to a claim, It was processing something that had been witnessed directly. Olivia's composure didn't hold, the confidence she had maintained fractured under the shift in attention, and her attempts to respond lacked the structure she had relied on before, her words no longer supported by the reaction she had expected to control. Angela's parents didn't speak immediately, their reactions delayed as the context they had accepted minutes earlier no longer aligned with what had just been shown, and, when they did respond, it wasn't with the same certainty, but with hesitation that exposed how quickly their judgment had formed without verification. The consequences didn't unfold dramatically, they settled in with a clarity that didn't require escalation. Olivia was no longer supported in the way she had been. The alignment that had existed moments earlier dissolved, leaving her without the position she had assumed was secure. Beyond the immediate reaction, the situation extended into something more concrete. Discussions of legal implications emerged among those close enough to understand the seriousness of fabricated evidence, and the potential for formal action became part of the outcome rather than an abstract possibility. Angela didn't engage in those discussions, she didn't need to, because her decision had already been made before the video was ever shown. She turned away from the center of the ceremony, not toward Derek, not toward her family, but toward the direction she had chosen years earlier when she first decided to leave a life that didn't value her. There was no announcement, no formal conclusion to what had been planned, only a clear action that redefined everything without requiring explanation. Derek didn't stop her, not because he didn't understand, but because he did, recognizing that what had been revealed wasn't limited to a single moment. It was part of a larger pattern that couldn't be separated from the decision she was making now. As Angela walked away, the structure of the event no longer mattered. The setting, the guests, the expectations, all of it became secondary to something far more defined. The choice to remove herself from a situation that repeated what she had already spent years escaping. What remained wasn't loss in the way others might define it, but clarity, a recognition that trust isn't built through proximity or shared history, and that family, when it operates without accountability, becomes no different from any other environment that demands acceptance without respect. For Angela, the outcome wasn't about proving someone wrong or correcting a moment. It was about refusing to remain in a pattern that had already shown her exactly what it was, and in that decision, she didn't just end a ceremony. She ended the expectation that she would continue to tolerate being defined by people who had never chosen to understand her.